Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this third event in our series. This is a meeting held under the auspices of the Wadham Human Rights Forum, the Department of Politics and International Relations, and the London Review of Books. This is the third in a series of seminars on prevent. The first one dealt with prevent in the academy, the second with prevent and policing, loosely, and this, I think, is going. This seminar this evening is going to deal, I think, with prevent as an aspect of the government's counter-terrorism policy for civil society. And our speaker is Professor Karma Nabulsi, and I'm delighted to welcome Karma here, who I've known for many years, and I'm sure she's going to give a formidable presentation this evening. Professor Nabulsi is a fellow in politics at St Edmund Hall, and she's director of the MPhil program in international.
No more.
Oh, was director of the MPhil program in international relations. She's the author of a number of works and books, including Traditions of War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Law. I think all these academic books always have colons in the middle, and the titles, and they have extremely long titles. So all I'm going to say is that she's the author of many interesting books and articles on subjects relevant to what she's going to say tonight. I haven't quite finished, Carl. The title of her talk tonight is Fear and Loathing in Luton, which is loosely based on a novel, sort of novel by Hunter S. Thompson, which describes a trip that he took with his attorney through Southern California and Nevada in the early 1970s, which is very comical, but probably best not to be tried too much at home. I think that Karma's talk is not going to be in any way comical, because it deals with, as I say, British government counter-terrorism policy and civil society, and there's not very much that's funny about that, I'm afraid. Anyway, Karma.
Thank you, Now, I could spend 30 minutes or more, or the entire time basically remaining to me, simply elaborating on the civic virtues of this young man, pay tribute to his courage and his fortitude, celebrate his intelligence and his collective service, and say what a privilege we Palestinians feel to have someone of his great spirit and moral fiber campaigning for our freedom, for swearing to his dad that he would, I quote, never stop talking about this for the rest of his life, being involved in this for the rest of his life. But Rahman also does something extremely useful for us, which can help us to explore what this new act has brought with it into the heart of our democracy, and the critical decisions we will all need to take in the coming weeks, both at this institution as well as on the national stage. There is a big battle ahead. Make no mistake. This isn't about them anymore. It profoundly affects all of you, all of us, and everyone has a role to play. Now, I have read and have heard countless experiences around prevent. So this one in Luton is illustrative of a broad phenomenon. This boy's experience at the hands of this policy and of the police, his response to it, and his analysis of why it was happening tells us a lot about our understanding of radicalism and extremism in this country. It also tells us quite a lot about racism and Islamophobia, which are the two factors that we really need to confront here. It raises the always mysterious, if always essential, properties of our collective political liberties, and raises the question of whether or not we really wish to keep them. There is one thing I would like to say about this boy's response to what happened to him for wearing the Free Palestine badge. With young British citizens like Rahman living in Luton as our exemplars, universities such as Oxford have a very good chance to stay free. For, as Ken has pointed out to us at the start of this series, prevent has indeed arrived at the Academy. Along with many others, I've been campaigning quite hard against this legislation for some time. So this may sound as counterintuitive, but I think we are really fortunate. Indeed, I think we are extremely lucky that Prevent has arrived at the universities, and we are not completely excluded or made much of an exception of. I know some exceptional people who have fought very hard to stop the legislation applying to us at the Academy, to our universities, and my friend and colleague here, who is a very distinguished fighter with a remarkable record. But I would say, based on past experience and the historical record of other struggles for freedom that are national in scope, in this country and elsewhere, we have a better chance to hang on to our freedoms if we are united with the rest of the country under this law, when we have finally become them. So seen in this light, arguing that the Prevent legislation should not apply here is to argue in a way that we are more naturally privileged and entitled, that we have more of a right to speak and debate and discuss civic and political and intellectual matters than others in this country do. Let's say at the Further Education Institute down the road, or let's say at a school in East Oxford, or indeed in Luton. And I might answer, well, what is the point of being able to chair a talk about academic freedom in Palestine at the student-convened Israel Apartheid Week at the Manor Road building, as I did the night before last, when police are coming to the house of a 15-year-old student in the dead of night in Luton, and when 2,000 out of the 4,000 referrals to Channel for extremism have been children? And I might ask, what exactly is happening in our schools? The Academy is therefore a place where we have a duty to protect the liberties of all of the citizens in this country. The responsibility of a university to defend, to protect, and to advance freedoms is its very purpose, contested, of course, though this has always been. Whatever exceptions or entitlements that we have been given as a university, whatever privileges we have been granted, obviously, therefore, these come with accompanying duties. And if we are seen to have more freedom than others under the Education Act that's not covered in the Human Rights Act, we should really be discussing this. But then naturally, we have more obligations to defend those who are not in the full legal possession of their inalienable rights. For there is also another tradition, one of ancient liberty and free speech at this university that I could evoke. Anyone who has lived and worked here would have bumped into this tradition in their common room. We might take, at this point, an interesting diversion here into the 13th century law lords. I'm a politics fellow at a college that was a stronghold of radical law lordism. I kid you not. Of course, some of them ended up being burnt at the stake. But anyway, what we need to understand from this is that this university has a very great tradition of protecting freedom of a religious kind a long, long time ago. So therefore, as most of you already know, we have many different traditions of liberty in this country. But if I can participate in public debates and discussions, in civic and political campaigning that Rahman cannot, this, in any person's definition, is not a democratic country. This is because public freedom is commonly owned. It belongs to its citizens. That is what a democracy is. Whether you are privileged as a student here under what one would like to interpret, and I think T and I were talking about that last night, of the Education Act and the extension of it to students. And one could get very angry about reactionary and colonial tutors at examination schools lecturing you that the British Empire was the best thing that happened to the Middle East. And I kid you not, there was one. While you, as a better informed and more educated student than your tutor, expresses anger about this racist colonialism with your friends in the college lodge. But you can do this without any fear of being reported by your porter as a key individual under the legislation in your college. On the other hand, if later that day you find yourself at the doctor's surgery, where he reports you to the police for saying you are depressed, because you're watching the news about Syria, because it depresses you and it makes you angry at the same time, and because you happen to be Asian or Arab in origin, or anything really but white, as happened the other day. So the privileges and protections of my first example here, where the Education Act could be protecting you, are unfortunately not sustainable. For unless you understand well your political rights under the Human Rights Act, not only the right to assemble and protest and discuss, but most of all, the citizen's right to interpret and collectively make of these laws what you want of them, then you might end up being secretly filmed by your chaplain as another key individual in your university prayer room, as has just happened in the University of Westminster. Prevent has indeed arrived at the Academy. So, after these many years of stories on Prevent in our towns and cities and communities, the new legislation has arrived at the location where those who work here used to feel, and some of them still do, that they have a duty, besides in Westminster and on our streets, to defend, protect, explain, and advance public liberties, especially our ancient Tory liberties, for of course we were at Oxford, as well as our more modern citizens' ones. That is why it is a good thing. And from here, the view becomes exceptionally clear. We can see exactly what is happening to our compatriots outside of the feudal centers of power in this country, of the lives of those who work and live inside our schools, hospitals, prisons, councils, libraries, and further education institutes, where key civic and political freedoms really have to breathe. Now, the reason it helps that the Prevent legislation has entered the Academy is because those people who matter, who have voice, with a capital V in this country, are suddenly forced to parse freedom and to understand it, especially the structures of the laws that underpin it, and by going over and over and over those detailed risk assessment templates, through the numbered boxes of the action plan and the Excel files, and the very fine print, and bureaucraties, I think as Jerry Cohen used to call it, it slowly reveals what they're really asking you to give up. And if you can just touch those freedoms that you don't want to lose, you can begin to fight for them. That is, you can begin to make a collective plan. Now, it has always been so. Once you have to conjugate freedom and see how it works for them, when you partly become them, you can get a sense of what is going on. At first, it looked to many that this legislation was a rather tedious health and safety regulation that had to be administered while holding one's nose. But it was certainly not dangerous if it was handled well by those in charge. It would only affect one's aesthetic sensibility rather than one's core rights. Indeed, it was designed to be presented as just such a legislation. However, once you begin to conjugate the active verb of freedom, the structure of this new act becomes more than troubling. You discover there is no possible way to fill in a form according to Hefke's non-statutory guidance, much less the statutory guidance, in any sort of formula without being in violation of a number of essential legislative acts that give formal recognition to our inalienable rights and liberties, and which we would very much like to keep. I will discuss how we might try to address some of this at the end of the talk, and to show how the eyes of our tutors and colleagues and students need to be our eyes. So there is a shared vision of our comments. In any case, I hope now that my first point has been completely made. I am happy, because we are now all in it together. So what else did Rahman tell us? He told us a lot of things. He showed us that no one understands freedom more than the unentitled, the disempowered, the disenfranchised. Indeed, this fact, as any good historian will tell you, is one of the empirical laws of freedom. When you fight for it, you know what it is, and you understand its value. But this puts us in an invidious position here. For the us has become them, but we don't quite feel it yet. How do you choose to hold on to a freedom if you can only appreciate it once you've lost it? And what if, during one of those earlier moments, before we are really enlightened to the content of our freedom, we have placed it for safekeeping in the hands of those who don't really care for it? At the moment, here at the Academy, many of us are counting on our elders and betters to formulate this policy for us, and especially our administrators, who are very, very keen to comply with this new legislation on our behalf. Besides our administrators, whose purpose is not freedom but compliance with regulations, there are only a few actors on this national stage at the moment playing a vital role in this terrible policy. Quite a small number of people, some very small institutions with, at the moment, exceptionally large reaches. Just one of these small group of institutions I would like to mention here is a small neoconservative outfit called the Henry Jackson Society, with an extreme agenda and very extreme politics, who are now working through some key government ministers of this Tory party in this present government and ministries, and very closely with certain sectors of the national press. Anyone that just spends half a day researching them can learn that they are having an overwhelming and unprecedented impact on this national strategy, the design and implementation of this huge counter-terror policy, and the radical shift that turns our entire public sector into very badly trained police, and turns our police into very badly trained security forces of a tin pot dictatorship from a Marx Brothers film. Press releases from the Henry Jackson Society end up in government policy publications. Paragraphs with completely false information about large numbers of hate preachers going around universities, and that have been completely refuted by these universities as fantasies, are repeated as government policy documents on prevent, repeated again in certain newspapers, and the cycle goes on and on until the policeman who is responsible for the prevent policy can only speak in terms of what the Daily Mail or the Telegraph will do to you if you don't apply their yardstick of morality. So what one learns when beginning to fill in these forms is that it is impossible to give a dozen key individuals, much less hundreds of thousands of people, this training. We have been collecting quotes from the training manuals, and they are quite shocking in their illustration, but they do show the impossibility of being able to make these judgments, much as Rahman, the 15-year-old schoolboy, was able to point out to us too. So let me just give you some of them. I've just got a little paragraph of them because they're quite extraordinary. So this is telling academics, bursars, deans, accountants, chaplains, and I quote, one of them says, you have to trust your gut. And to note that, quote, insignia and badges can be a sign of extremism, as well as tattoos, of course. And that, quote, kinds of speech that trigger prevent are, and I quote, closed, not open to discussion or criticism, scripted, speaking someone else's words, and fixed, only wanting to talk about one thing. So, obviously, they haven't participated in any discussion with the game theorists recently. Now, when reporting people, we are to understand, and I quote, as recent stories involving vulnerable students have shown, issues around Palestine, Syria, and the growth of ISIS require careful monitoring by those involved. And especially, I quote, here's another one, there is a rule of law that's crossed when someone encourages violence, and our instincts will tell us when someone wants to have a serious debate, when they are being sensationalist, and when they are generally being threatening, unquote. Our instincts will tell us. Have you had enough? I've got another set of quotes. Okay, so we now have the evidence that prevent training across this country before it has arrived in the academy, and the harm that it is doing. Under a Freedom of Information request to the police, We now know that over 80% of referrals to Channel for extremism and radicalization were entirely mistaken. Over 80% of referrals to a de-radicalization program were unnecessary. This extreme level of fear and loathing engendered by the PREVENT policy, the impossibility after one is trained of ever being able to know what extreme or radical even looks like, the created stupidity of people, as Rahman would call it, who do not know and cannot know more than 1% of what is going on. Very succinctly and accurately, can draw only one conclusion. That this is not 80% over-reporting, and it is not a mistake. That this is a central plank of the policy. To shut down dissent, to close down activism around certain kinds of foreign policy, to stop Rahman's friends from getting politically active, to think again before raising the flag for justice, and to criticize foreign adventures, colonialism, which this country has an almost viciously violent collective amnesia about British troops and what they did in Fallujah. Now, how can we solve this dilemma? To allow them to be us in a way that strengthens us all and prepares us to deal with this new legislation in a thoughtful and coherent fashion. It is to acquire an understanding of freedom that is universal and is grounded and that is real. Jean Genet, a writer I much admired, answered this question in a particular way. I was fortunate enough to meet him and know him a little in Beirut in the very early 1980s, when I was the age of the undergraduates here, and when he had come to rededicate himself to the Palestinian cause for freedom, as he had done in the 1960s and 70s. Jean-Paul Sartre, a philosopher who spent almost all of his time writing about freedom and appreciated Genet's understanding, wrote about this, but he connected it to Frantz Fanon's. This position on freedom, on seeing them and us, and understanding what is the right thing to do, is what he described it as seeing things through the gaze of the least favored. That is, if you wish to know where to place yourself, discover the view of the most disenfranchised, the weakest, the most vulnerable, and put yourself there. Now, holding this gaze, what would our university's submission to the risk assessment and action plan to comply with our duty to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism then look like? It would look something like this. 10 pages, maybe 12, of boxes that outline carefully detailed training of our administration, of our key important individuals, on how to protect our rights and our liberties as students, staff, and faculty, and as enshrined in the relevant sections of the Human Rights Act, the Education Act, our freedom of expression, so that we are compliant with those laws. It would require a huge amount, really proper training, to remain a university under this assault and under these conditions. And that's what we would then have to do. And it means that we would need to learn what is unconscious bias in racism, not just gender, in order to be compliant with the existing legislation before we can look at the new one. So it's only once we can see through those eyes, free eyes, could we possibly understand what form compliance should take with this new counter-terror legislation, and how we should seek to enact our compliance, replete in our liberties and secure in the compliance with the laws that protect us. So there are two distinct paths before us. As someone once said, when you get to a fork in the road, pick it up. So let me conclude by picking up that fork and rehearse for you the difference between these two roads in more conceptual, less immediate framing. Now, our discussion over this past decade on how to defeat terrorism, and what they have been telling us are the unique conditions of modern society, has been couched up till now in a simple dichotomy: the tension between civil liberties and security, which of course the title of our seminar series reflects. However, this formula is not a decade old. It is centuries old, as is the philosophy that underpins it. Articulated by the one and only Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, this ideology sets out a very cold contract between individuals and the Leviathan to form the state. The individual surrenders part of his liberty to purchase security, which is the sovereign's job to determine. Now, it is this model that has been reinstated in force by Tony Blair over a decade ago. Ken could tell you many stories about that. And it has been accelerated by the government of the day through the Prevent legislation, and without adequate resistance from either the left or from the right. Yet to accept this representation of modern political realm as an inevitable conflict between security and liberty, or even accepting the debate on these terms, means yielding to the highly limited framework in which it is set. You need instead to pick up the fork on the road. Now, in order to make the arguments for this such a social contract persuasive, Hobbes persuades and that he portrays a dangerous world filled with unknown enemies, perpetually striving to murder your family and destroy your property. A nation filled with untrustworthy neighbors, isolated individuals who live in fear of each other, and only the power of the state to protect societies from the evils inherent in human nature. How much of your liberty do you yield to your protector? As much as he says he needs to provide you with protection. This bargain is how we understand this legislation and can be measured in every aspect of public life in Britain. If the primary purpose of the state is to provide the individual with security, this gives the state an exclusive power to define the gravity of the security threat. And at that point, of course, we herald the arrival of the security and terrorism experts. It is out of our hands, unless, of course, you are working at the DPIR, my department, and just dying to give advice to government on how to identify those potential future terrorists, as some of them are doing. But giving the state this purpose also allows it to actually define for you your civil and individual liberties, since these must be surrendered according to an assessment of our security needs that are made behind closed doors. More fundamentally, political liberty is possessed entirely by the state, for it is in such a framework the state determines what liberties to grant to individuals. The source of sovereignty resides entirely in the state, not in the individual. Not to repeat the first year prelims lecture in politics, but just to confirm, this conception of the social contract is indeed a theory of state, but it is not a democratic one. For we are not customers or consumers who buy our security, and we are not living in Hobbes's imaginary state of terror. Nor can deploying an entire country of nurses or nursery school teachers as police informants can assist us in governing our collective public space. This country possesses a very rich philosophy, language, and traditions of liberty and democratic life that confront and can vanquish the bleak model that's presented by Hobbes. Now, the other path in the road. This theory of the democratic state described the nature of the social contract in the opposite way to Hobbes, defined in this country by writers such as Mill, Tawney, Cole, among others, and on the continent, thinkers such as Rousseau. The only purpose of the contract is to protect a citizen's liberty. Its preservation, especially the preservation of political liberty, is the supreme good. In this version of the social contract, the sovereign citizen does not surrender sovereignty, only specific powers and functions to the state. as political sovereignty is not transferred to the state, not only are civil rights inalienable, but so are political liberties. Above all, the right to determine and to deliberate the laws. It is not simply participating in these decisions or being consulted on them. It is being bound only by the laws that we make. Yet if we are citizens who live in a democratic country, why has it become so difficult for the young citizens of today to contain this authoritarian project of the government and to participate in the political framework in a way that restores the democratic heartbeat of this country? The relationship between Britain's illiberal and unjust policies abroad is intimately connected with the stripping away of democratic liberty at home. Allowing the government to define foreign policy in this way is surrendering this obligation. And if I had time, and maybe if we can in the questions, to talk about the role of not teaching the history of colonialism in this country and what it has done and its impact. In the end, the essential principle of democracy is that no single part of a vibrant democratic system, the judiciary, the media, campaigners or interest groups, political parties, legislatures, or local governments, can confront the authoritarian state alone. All are obliged to work together to preserve and maintain citizens' liberty. For neither elections nor human rights law alone will ever give citizens freedom, nor provide the guarantors of democracy. As Cole reminded us, laws are the scaffolding of human freedom, but they are not part of the building. So we must decide what belongs to us. That is a political statement. That is a political decision about the nature of our liberty. The laws must reflect and come after that decision. What does this mean in practice? That we must first comply with the laws that protect our freedom, rather than those that are specifically designed to take them away. That is our only shield. Or to go back to the theoretical understandings, we need to comply with the obligations of freedom. Hobbes's contract creates not only fear, it creates distrust in a government making all the crucial decisions. Hobbes, as we know, made his argument to answer a specific problem of exceptional insecurity. But the trade-off he suggests is and remains flawed. This formula will never provide us with the security that we need. Instead, it simply increases our need for it. We can see where we have gotten to in this university, according to this Hobbesian logic. We have building securities making academic decisions on a weekly basis. And we've got an enormous list of it now, of these incidents. So if we can restore citizens, at least in this city, to their role in deliberating these decisions, we cede the public space and the universities back to their owners. And if we cannot do this at Oxford freely in the academy, where can it be done in this country? We have, all of us, to answer to Rahman. Thank you.